Hello and welcome to the latest episode of the Ponsonby and Massie podcast. We're back after a brief hiatus because I was on holiday, but it's great to be back with you. There's only one issue in town really this week. It's the long-awaited launch of Nicola Sturgeon's memoirs titled Frankly, for which she was paid an advance amounting to around £300,000. The book is being published on Thursday, so we are limited to some extent as to what we can say about it, but there have been excerpts from it published in the Times and the Sunday Times last weekend, a long interview with Nicola Sturgeon in the Sunday Times magazine, another interview with her on ITV that will be broadcast on Monday evening, that we've had some indication as to what she's saying in that. So this is the first of two shows this week in which we consider Nicola Sturgeon and her memoirs and her her account of an extraordinary period in Scottish politics. We are going to talk about the information that's been in the public domain so far today, and then later in the week, Bernard, we're going to talk about some of the things that have not appeared in the Times and the Sunday Times or in any of the other sort of pre-publication publicity and marketing drive for the book, because there is going to be a lot of other stuff that obviously there isn't room for in brief serializations in newspapers. But Bernard, you've been reading the book already, I believe, and so without giving away too much or going into the specifics, which are still under embargo, what's your overall sense of Frankly by Nicola Sturgeon?
Well, of course, your newspaper, The Times, and the Sunday Times have been over this with a fine-tooth comb. And of course, when these, it's not quite a serialization, it's really just a series of extracts. When these are run editorially, you clearly run the ones which are the most interesting, which are the most newsworthy, which will mean more to the biggest audience. And I think that it is therefore reasonable to conclude that since the extracts that we have had, one which yet again went over the disintegration of the relationship with Alex Salmond, not sure that there was much that was terribly new. There was one line, an allegation, which she made that he might have been behind a leak, which has been vehemently denied by Mr. Salmond's supporters and indeed the journalist who kicked off the whole story. But not a lot there. And all of the other stuff is, you could call stuff which is deeply personal. Her arrest, her finding out that she wouldn't face charges, her miscarriage, her marriage, and so on and so forth. So these are the most interesting lines according to the Times. And therefore, I think that it is reasonable to conclude that if the historians in 30 or 40 years' time are writing up this time in Scottish politics, and they're looking for a political memoir, which is going to be crackling with political insight, which will take you in to the corridors of power about what was really happening on a whole series of policy issues, and that the memoir, therefore, is instructive in helping to tell the story of this time, then I think you're going to be very disappointed by this memoir. And in a sense, that is not really surprising, because Scottish politics is a village. You don't need any gossips in the village to tell you what's going on. You just need to be in the village to know what's going on. And therefore, there was never any chance, in my view, that this memoir was going to be revelatory in political terms. So what she has done as a consequence is to concentrate on the personal stuff. And here I think it, in some respects, is really rather odd, because Nicola Sturgeon, perhaps more so than most politicians, was somebody who was intensely private. A number of MPs and MSPs who would have regarded themselves as essentially on her side in terms of internal issues within the party would tell you that although they saw a lot of her, they didn't really know terribly much about her. And therefore, there's this massive disconnect, in a sense, between the public profile and the private individual. And what this memoir does, in really quite graphic terms, is to tell you that the public persona of somebody who was in control, who was always ready with an argument, who was the very embodiment of being utterly confident in the case that she was pursuing in private. When she went home at night and she locked the door, there were demons which reigned occasionally from self-doubt, and then at the point when she left office to being on the verge of a breakdown. And so what this memoir does, and I think the interesting point about it, is that it brings home in very sharp terms the difference between the public image of a politician and what a politician is feeling privately, because she was anything but the self-confident politician that she sometimes held herself out to be.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I mean, despite your suggestion that there isn't very much in the way of political revelation in the memoir and so on, I do urge listeners to keep listening, because we do have plenty to talk about, not just in this show but also later in the week about it all. I mean, I think you are right that one of the of the excerpts published in the Times and the Sunday Times last weekend, by the most interesting in certain respects was her account of her pregnancy and her miscarriage, and the ambivalence that she felt about being pregnant at all. She wasn't sure whether she really desperately wanted children or not, but her husband, Peter Murrell, did, and was ecstatic and cock-a-hoop. And there is it's rather painful, I think, actually, and quietly moving, actually, to read her account of how she felt that she couldn't really talk openly, even with him, about her feelings, about her mixed feelings, her ambivalence, as I say, because he was so cock-a-hoop about her pregnancy and the prospect of becoming a father, and she had misgivings about it. And this was obviously just not just in terms of her personal life, but also her political life, I suppose, because she would have been keenly aware of the difficulties of becoming a mother at an older age and juggling that with senior, weighty political responsibilities. I mean, of course, we've had last week Kate Forbes deciding to leave the Scottish Parliament next year because she has a young daughter and she would like more children, and she feels that she wouldn't be able to be the kind of mother she wants to be while holding senior elected office. And so I think that anguish that you see from Nicola Sturgeon when she's talking about her pregnancy and then losing the baby is something where even those people who don't have very much time for her politically or indeed personally would nevertheless struggle to read that without feeling very significant sympathy for the position, the predicament, if you like, in which she found herself. And so that was, that was actually quite painful to read, I thought, actually. And you would have to have a heart of stone not to feel some empathy for her in that, because it's a very personal thing, obviously, and there is a certain amount of courage, I think, in putting it quite so openly on the page. But it's the sort of thing that a lot of women in particular, I suspect, particularly professional women in their late 30s and early 40s, can probably empathize with and understand as well, to a degree that perhaps is less approachable for a lot of men for all sorts of obvious reasons. But beyond that, yes, the other parts of the excerpts that we've had released so far are not particularly revelatory, save to the extent that when she's talking about the investigation into alleged financial malpractice within the SNP and its handling of its accounts, she is the hard luck story there. And again, one can feel from a personal point of view that being investigated by the police for a prolonged period of time, and there are, I think, reasonable questions to be asked and perhaps answered as to why the police investigation, Operation Branch Form, took so long, was protracted over so many months and indeed years. Nevertheless, she is not actually the victim here. If there is a victim, it is the SNP that is allegedly had hundreds of thousands of pounds, perhaps, embezzled from it. And there is, on the excerpts published so far, there isn't very much examination of the dynamic between her position as leader of the party and the fact her husband, as chief executive of the party, is the person who ends up being charged by the police and by the Crown Office. And obviously, we await to see what happens next in that story. But she is not actually the victim there, is she?
Well, no. Although what she does say, and I mean, this is again perfectly understandable. If any of us were questioned by the police about something, and this comes across that she repeats several times, I knew that I wasn't guilty of anything, but I was acutely conscious that out there in the wider public, there is always this view, well, there's no smoke without fire. And what that alludes to is that even although you're the subject of an investigation, and even although that you're told that you're in the clear, and even although you are in the clear in terms of any culpability, nevertheless, in the body of public opinion, there's always a certain number of people who will say, "Aha." But they wouldn't have been knocking on her door unless there was something to investigate in the first place. But the writing style of this is really quite interesting, because it doesn't really change throughout the book, and it's done in a very sort of matter of fact way. And because it's done in very matter of fact, and I'm not going to give any indication as to content, obviously, but the writing style on matter of fact style on events which we all know about, really, I think, can induce a yawn. Let me put it that way. It can induce a yawn because it is just so matter of fact. If you're taking issues which aren't very matter of fact and you want them to live a bit more, I think having a writing style does actually help to make the mundane live. But there's quite a lot of the mundane which doesn't really live at all. That being said, this matter of fact writing style paradoxically works when she's talking about herself, because she just states it. She just states that she was depressed. She just states that she was at her lowest ebb. And it's there in very uncomplicated language. And in that sense, in the latter part of the book, this matter of fact style, I think, works in terms of its ability to move the reader. You're right that you can't really read this stuff without, on a basic human level, having a degree of empathy for someone who was clearly struggling. You would have to have a heart of stone not to have empathy. The problem, I think, and it's not a problem because she's now out of frontline politics, but the issue here is quite simple. By the end of her time as First Minister, she was a Marmite politician, as Alex Salmond had become a Marmite politician. And perhaps the lesson is that after sort of 5 to 7 years in government, that you really run your course, that perhaps everybody who serves 5 to 7 years ends up becoming a Marmite politician. Is that the sort of sympathy that you and I are expressing in this podcast for the plight of somebody who, let's not forget, was dealing with issues like COVID, which were enormous responsibilities, which would have weighed heavily on anyone of any gender, of any political party. Of course, you should have sympathy for that. But out there in the court of public opinion, because she's a Marmite politician, those who wish to do her down will simply look upon these crises in her personal life, and they will exploit them to try and bury her down a drain of poisoned social media posts. And indeed, in the serialization in your own newspaper, The Times, which I subscribe to, and which I would
Quite right, Bernard. Quite right.
which
I've always said, Bernard, that you're a splendid fellow.
I subscribe to, if only to keep you in baked beans and pan breed. That some of the comments which are left at the bottom of these articles from people who are literate, clearly hold down professional jobs, depress no end. You know, attack her politics, attack her record, attack her style, attack her party, but to exploit something as part of the human condition, which we're, I suppose, all capable of experiencing, is a bit low. But then again, that's where our public discourse is.
It is rather, yes. Yeah, and I mean, I think we could do an entire week's worth of episodes on the extent to which, or pondering the question as to whether social media in particular and the nature in which it has sort of encouraged people to communicate and so on has helped our political discourse or not. And I think the answer to that is probably pretty clear. Um, uh, but I mean, Nicola Sturgeon, I mean, she's a frustrating politician in many ways, because there's somebody with with real gifts and attributes in certain respects, but who is also extremely slippery when it comes to how she actually deals with things. So, for instance, in the handling of COVID, she quite rightly said, in Parliament and on television, time and time again, look, this is an unprecedented situation. We are going to get things wrong. And we will make mistakes. It's unavoidable, because we are all to some extent flying blind here. And that was a very reasonable thing to say. It was absolutely true. There was no way in which any government anywhere could avoid making mistakes in the handling of a pandemic of that sort when they're being thrown into a genuinely unprecedented situation for which none of them really have proper training or experience to deal with. But then, in a very typical Nicola Sturgeon way, I would suggest, whenever anyone said, well, what specific mistakes did you make? And we saw some of this when she was giving evidence to the COVID inquiry. It turns out that there weren't specific mistakes. There were general mistakes, but specifically, no. And so, when you come to publishing a memoir, a political memoir of this sort, and there is always the danger with these memoirs that they become, and one damn thing after another. We did this, and then we did that, and then I had a meeting with so and so, and then then it was time for the annual conference, and I had to make a speech, and then it was time to do
There's
this,
a lot
etc.,
of
etc.,
that.
etc. Yeah, and that's a problem with the genre, if you like. But these memoirs are, they're presented as a sort of as a tell-all thing. Frankly, at long last, Nicola Sturgeon is going to tell you what she really thinks, what she really did, a real appraisal of her time in politics, warts and all. Given all of that, people expect there to be some kind of reckoning. And when you have somebody like Nicola Sturgeon, who has been through an awful lot, I mean, this has the potential to be an extraordinary story. The disintegration of her relationship with Alex Salmond is a sort of Shakespearean style drama. That is worth a book on its own, and indeed books have been written about it. People have an expectation that there will be stuff there, and that there will be a full accounting, and that requires the author to say, yeah, this is where we messed up, this is what we should have done better, this is why we messed up, and so on and so on. And so that sort of duty of candor is the kind of thing that I think a lot of readers expect from these books. But of course, politicians writing them don't see it that way. They see it as that these books are, if you like, a form of battlement, a rampart, a moat around their reputation, to protect them, to put their side of the story, but to protect them against their critics, not to concede that their critics might have a point from time to time. And so there is a basic tension, if you like, between what a lot of readers are wanting from these books and what the authors of these books are hoping to achieve from the process. And so that is a sort of structural problem with the genre as a whole, I suppose. And so I'd ask you this, Bud, and so just more broadly, I mean, away from Nicola Sturgeon, but a little digression here and so on, if you're thinking about successful political memoirs that are actually worth reading, on both a personal level and because of what they tell you about the politics of a time. So, what two or three, if there are indeed as many as two or three, what two or three such memoirs come to mind to you with all your vast experience of these things?
Well, I mean, you're right that there is a problem with the genre. And not everybody approaches these kind of things in the same way. I mean, I think Dennis Healy's memoir was particularly fascinating. I think Roy Jenkins's memoir, A Life at the Centre. I think of the prime ministerial ones, which surprised me. Time and Chance, James Callaghan's, was particularly good. But what they do, and the first thing to say that in the case of Healy, particularly in the case of Jenkins, less so in the case of Callaghan, these to a certain extent are very well written. They're
Mm.
very, very engaging to read, whether or not you're obsessed about the content. And of course, you have it's not it's a different thing, but the sort of the Castle Diaries, the Ben Diaries, all this kind of stuff takes you behind some of the cabinet debates. What, and again, I'm not giving anything away here. What you don't really get from this book is that, or perhaps what you do is that there were no debates going behind the scenes. But perhaps the problem was that there was one strong leader, pretty direct, maybe even autocratic, in Alex Salmond, and he was replaced by someone whose style, in terms of taking decisions and not having everything done in a collective way, was very, very similar. And that's why I say that whereas political historians, the sort of Peter Hennessy's and the Anthony Selznick people would have found books, by Thatcher, even the Blair one, which I think is atrociously written.
Yes, that's the
The
journey, isn't
journey,
it?
yes. I thought it was
Yeah.
atrociously written, but again, in parts, if you were sitting as a political anorak, you would get your highlighter pen out and say, "That's very interesting. I must commit that to memory." Particularly around things like the Northern Ireland peace process, where I found the chapters really very, very interesting. There's not a lot here that's going to keep me from insomnia. That is one of the issues of this. But then again, and I mean, I don't mean this in a disparaging way, but she is, after all, articulating what happened in Scottish politics, in the Scottish Parliament, which, of course, does not have any responsibility for any big international affairs, doesn't have responsibility for strategic issues around defence, doesn't take huge macroeconomic decisions, and therefore, by the nature of it, a lot of it does read as tales from the kale yard. And in that sense, it is never, because of the ground that it covers, it is never going to be stand comparison with the memoir of a prime minister. It's more interesting about the emotional journey of Nicola Sturgeon just as much as the political journey. And in some respects, I think this book has been a form of therapy for her, and there's a lot of self analysis. And what is also clear is that she was busy taking decisions a lot of the time and not really thinking, well, how are my colleagues thinking about this? Am I being too dismissive here? Am I throwing this person, again, very careful what I say, am I throwing this person under the bus? There are times when there's a lot of regret for the consequences of her actions on other people, which seem to suggest there's old Nicola, who wasn't very self aware, and there's the new Nicola, having had the cathartic experience of reliving this and writing it all down, who can now see the personal shortcomings of the old Nicola.
Yes, and she says that she is now. I think you're right that it has been a sort of therapeutic process for her because she now says that after everything she has been through in the last couple of years, obviously stepping down from her office much sooner, much earlier than most people anticipated. Remember that was a big surprise to most people when she decided to step down. I think there was a sense that after COVID, which had been such an all-consuming period in politics, particularly for those in leadership positions, then what came next was was pale and dry and unexciting and unappealing, and she was also, I suspect, exhausted as well after COVID leadership and so on. So that was something that informed her decision to stand down much sooner than most people had anticipated. Then, obviously, the Operation Branch Form stuff, the arrest of Peter, her own arrest, the disintegration of her marriage. Although she says again that was not an event; it was a process. It was something that had been happening bit by bit, perhaps without often being fully aware that it was happening, but for quite a prolonged period of time. And again, I think there are plenty of people and so on who can empathize and have a degree of sympathy with the situation she found herself in then. And so, yes, this has become a therapeutic enterprise, writing this book. And as a result, she says that she is in a much happier place now than she has been for really quite some considerable time. It would be gauche to say that is also because she's much wealthier than she has been previously, as a result of writing this book. But it doesn't hurt, does it? On the when you just go back a little bit on the stuff you were talking about, memoirs and so on. I think you're right that leaders' memoirs are often unsatisfying, partly because of that. It's one damn thing after another, type thing. So David Cameron's book, For the Record, has occasional bits that are quite interesting if you just want to dip into it to read the 5 pages about such and such an issue or such and such a problem. But over 600 pages, it becomes too much, and the individual bits get lost. I think so. A lot of the time, the more interesting books are written by people who are on the fringes.
Absolutely. I mean,
so somebody like David Laws, the former Lib Dem Chief Secretary of the Treasury, instrumental in the forming of the Conservative Lib Dem coalition. His book is much more interesting than the books written by Cameron or by Clegg or whoever. You think of someone like Rory Stewart, fundamentally a failure, but therefore more interesting. And so his book, which is also very well written, is interesting, even if it is also extremely, if you like, self-pleasuring, in terms of justifying everything that Rory Stewart ever said and thought, at the expense most often of Boris Johnson, but also everyone else. Actually, it's interesting too.
You're right in that. You're absolutely right in that. And I'll give you a couple of conservative ones I did the other month, and I forgot the name of it. Oh, it's age. William Waldegrave's.
Yes, brilliant.
It's a smashing book and very, very funny, and very much in the same vein. And we are going back a long, long way. A little book called A Bag of Boiled Sweets, which was Julian Critchley's. And again, written with high degrees of self-deprecation, but written with a very sharp political eye, just very, very good. And what marks these books out is a fine writing style. Now, Nicola Sturgeon has said that she may well take herself off and write a novel.
Oh God!
She's going to have a slightly different writing style, because, as I said, the style of this book is matter of fact, and whilst that works towards the end of the book, it, in my view, doesn't work towards the early stuff. But there we go. In terms of sort of Scottish political memoirs, there's not really, very few. The First Ministers, we haven't had terribly much. Alex Salmond's book on the referendum is a
dreadful,
appalling book, is an absolutely dreadful book. And now he does have a sharp, I remember reading this and thinking, this has literally been pumped out in less than a week. It was just, it was so unsalmon-like in the sense, because it was just so lacking in sharp observation. It was so surface.
Yes, Salmon's one, it was remarkable, is his referendum diaries, or purported to be his referendum diaries. I think they were probably constructed after the fact. But a remarkable journey around Scotland in which he never meets anyone who votes no. You're right. I'm very pleased you mentioned William Waldegrave and so on, because yes, his memoir is tremendous, and as you say, very self-deprecating. So he tells a great story about how he was out campaigning with Tony Marlowe, and as Waldegrave says, not exactly a meeting of political minds. Marlowe ended up backing John Redwood in his leadership heave against John Major. And Waldegrave was, very much on the wet wing of the Conservative Party in that period, and Marlowe, very old-fashioned, shall we say, Conservative MP. And anyway, they're out campaigning and so on. And this vote, they knock on a door, and this voter starts haranguing Marlowe. Says, you said you were going to deal with the immigrants, and you haven't hanged any of them. And Marlowe says, well, I'm terribly sorry. So I dare say perhaps we'll try and get round to that in the next Parliament and so on. And the guy says, I'm not having any of it. I'm voting Liberal Democrat.
Yes. Yes. Now that you've mentioned that, I do actually recall that one. That would be the kind of thing that you would underline. But
Waldegrave then says, such are the joys of democracy. I was reminded once again of the joys of the democratic process, etc., etc.
Absolutely. There's actually probably I might even write this one myself, because I used to always say to politicians, give me your favorite canvassing story from the doorsteps or a public meeting. And I have a computer file somewhere with all of these written down. So that might make a little stocking filler one Christmas if I can ever get round to putting all of these together. But we've got this ITV interview with Julie Etchingham tonight at 7:00. There'll be some stuff that will come out of that. The book is published on Thursday. Although it is not heavy with what I would call political fallout, there are nevertheless one or two observations which would merit us going over in a podcast. So towards the end of the week, we'll chew over some of that on, and the gender ID stuff has already been referenced in the trail for the ITV interview tonight, so we can come back on some of that and go back over that. And once we do, we can more definitively come to a firm assessment about whether or not this memoir is an exercise in self-justification. What does it tell us about the way in which the country was governed? What does it tell us about her governing style? And indeed, and just I'll offer this final observation. For a politician who's a Scottish politician, isn't it interesting that the television interview she gives is to effectively an English network, because ITV does not own the two television franchises in Scotland. So the interview is with an English network. There's a huge event being done, which is being chaired by Cathy Newman of Channel 4 News. I think it's at the Queen Elizabeth Centre or something in London. That quite a lot of the stuff from a Scottish politician is actually the conduit for it, is events in England and with an English broadcaster. But then again, that's where the money is.
Well, it's also a reflection that even the tribunes of Scottish nationalism and so on, the London stage is the larger arena on which they like to strut their stuff from time to time. It's one of the reasons why Alex Salmond was much happier in many respects in the House of Commons than he ever was in the Scottish Parliament, particularly when he was in opposition in the Scottish Parliament, which was not a period of time that he particularly enjoyed. It was too small a pond for him. And so something similar might be said of Nicola Sturgeon and her memoir. I completely understand why she preferred to have the book published by a London house, because the London houses have the money to pay her a significant advance to a degree that no Scottish publisher could match. But I also have it on good authority from a source within the publishing industry and so on, that Sturgeon's, when asked, so why aren't you giving your memoirs or selling your memoirs to a Scottish publisher, that Nicola Sturgeon said, quote, they weren't good enough. That is, by that I think she really means, they weren't wealthy enough. But you're right, there is a difference, I think, a distinction to be drawn between the reception received by Nicola Sturgeon south of the border, particularly, if you like, on the sort of soft left or the progressive left of British politics south of the border, and the reception she receives in Scotland, where people are obviously more intimately acquainted with her, both in terms of her strengths, but particularly, obviously, in terms of her shortcomings and her weaknesses and her failures, and are more prepared to render a pitiless verdict on those failures than is the case south of the border, where they see a bigger picture. She hated Boris Johnson and she hated Brexit, and so therefore she must be on the right side of history. Well, viewed from North Britain, things are more complicated than that. I'm actually writing a column on this very subject for tomorrow's Times.
I can
tell. Yes, English viewers, start here.
Right.
But, yes, we will be back later in the week. I hope viewers and listeners will be back with us too, as we get into the bones of some of the detail of Nicola Sturgeon's memoirs, her political failures, her political successes, where the independence movement in the SNP is right now and where it might go in the future, if indeed her memoirs tell us anything about any of that. But for the time being, thank you very much for being with us. But it is goodbye from me.
And it's goodbye from me.